Our issues, our voices, our views. This is Politics in Black. What's happening, family? We are back and we are live on another broadcast of Politics in Black, brought to you by the LA chapter of the NAASD. That's the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants in LA.
You ready for today?
I'm ready for today, Friday. You know I'm ready for today. I'm fired up for today because we are, well, first of all, this is the last show.
This is our last show for this calendar year.
Yeah, we are going into hiatus after this show, but we wanted to end on a high note. We wanted to end on a bang, and I think we put it together. I think we did it. But thank you again, family, for joining us and being here on your Sunday. Remember, like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. If you feel so inclined, if you can help us support and keep what we're doing here going, hit the Cash App or hit the Venmo, $NAASDLA. So today, the title of this show is Lineage Reparations. So we're going to have a conversation about the importance
of the case for lineage reparations.
The case for lineage reparations. Yes. So we're going to be talking a little legality today, right? And to kick it off, we've got a giant. We got a giant coming here to talk to us, and I don't know if you want to say anything about on Friday. I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce us, right? If it's your first time here, my name is Chad Brown. I've been talking to her, Friday Jones over here. You know, Friday, what do you want to say to the people today?
All I want to say is let's go. We really have some heavy hitters. Anytime anyone has appeared in front of the Supreme Court, we have to take an opportunity to learn from them. And so our first guest, we've got a big hitter out of Berkeley. I'm going to let Chad do the intros, but we are super stoked for the show. We've been talking about it all week. It's finally here. Hopefully you guys will leave comments, questions, in our comment sections on YouTube, because we will be taking some comments and questions from the audience today.
Yeah,
so let's
and
go.
Reach out. Tell all reparationists to pull up for this. All reparationists need to pull up for this conversation. But coming first to Politics in Black today, we've got Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. And Erwin Chemerinsky is an American leading legal scholar known for his studies of U.S. constitutional law and federal civil procedure. He served as the founding dean of the University of California Irvine School of Law from 2008 to 2017 and is currently the dean of the University of California Berkeley School of Law. A study of legal publications between 2016 and 2020 found Chemerinsky to be the most frequently cited American legal scholar. He is one of our American treasures in the legal field. So please welcome to Politics in Black, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's truly my honor and pleasure to talk with you.
Well, it is our honor and pleasure to have you here, Dean. We had a conversation leading up to this that we just had to share with our audience because you enlightened us in a way that and moved our thinking in a way that we weren't previously thinking. So thank you for being here and sharing some information with the audience today that we're about to get into. Starting off, Dean, we reached out to you because, as you know, the AB 3121 California Reparations Task Force is currently meeting. And here in California, we have what's called Prop 209. And a concern of ours has been from the beginning that anything as far as proposals or measures that go towards repairing the Black Americans here in California, they would be constrained by Prop 209. And so we reached out to you for an opinion on that, and you gave us some information that we had not heard before. So I really just want to start right there with Prop 209. If you could talk about your understanding of it and then how it pertains to our fight here and our push for reparative proposals or atonement here at the state level.
Sure. Prop 209, which was adopted in 1996, is a part of the California Constitution. It prohibits the state and any subdivision of the state from giving preference or discriminating on the basis of race or sex in education, employment, or contracting. So if reparations were done outside of the realm of education, employment, or contracting, Prop 209 is no obstacle. If, for example, it was a sum of money given to people it wouldn't be a problem under Prop 209. Also, it's important that what's prohibited is preference or discrimination on the basis of race.
Yes.
If the beneficiaries were defined, say, by lineage, those who could show they were descendants of slaves, whether African or Native American, let's say, then I think you could be outside the realm of Prop 209 as well and not need to worry about it.
Absolutely. And that's what you shared with us, which squarely aligned with what we were thinking out here as far as using a lineage standard to determine eligibility, and something we've been talking to the task force about as well.
It's something we've been talking to the task force, and we also spoke with a member of Mark Ridley Thomas's, who's a city council member here in Los Angeles, and his staff about changing the city charter to speak to a lineage-based in order to really get around the race thing. Very often, race and ethnicity is not applied to Black Americans. Black Americans really only cross a racial bar. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts surrounding the Office of Budget Management, who sets the standards for the census, in terms of exploring or expanding like an American ethnicity specifically based on lineage that might also give protections in the space that indigenous Native American nations have protections.
You could. I think the easiest, though, is simply to define the reparations statute, whether it's federal or state, based on lineage. Mm-hmm. Those who could show that they were descendants of slaves be entitled to the reparation. This could include those who are Black, but there's an article in today's San Francisco Chronicle about Native Americans who were enslaved in California. It could include them as well. There would be Blacks who would not be beneficiaries of this, mm-hmm. those who came to the country after slavery had ended. Yeah. And I think by showing that it is lineage-based and not race-based, you take yourself out of the realm of Prop 209, you take yourself out of the realm of a strong federal constitutional challenge. There is a practical problem, and you know it better than anyone. Records from that time are so incomplete, it may be very difficult for people to prove lineage, but that's a practical question that would need to then be confronted if this is going to be defined in terms of lineage rather than race.
I'd like to ask you, Dean, and we squarely agree with you that lineage should be the standard, and that is how we should move forward on any reparations package, either in the state of California or federally. But in your legal opinion, if it is not a lineage standard, and say it's a standard that includes all Black people, quote unquote Black people, what do you think the repercussions of something like that would be?
In terms of the United States Constitution, it means you would have to show that this is something that's necessary to achieve a compelling purpose. Given the current Supreme Court, that's going to be a standard very difficult to meet. In terms of Prop 209, if you're in the realm of education, employment, or contracting, mm-hmm. and this seen as a preference based on race, then it flat out isn't going to be allowed.
It kills it.
Here
right
I'm just
there.
reporting the law to you.
Yeah. No, it kills it right there. If by some measure what we see come out of the California task force is based instead on melanin versus lineage, what I hear you saying is Prop 209 leaves us dead in the water when we're talking about employment, education, or contracting, and then we open ourselves up to a larger challenge of equal protection is one of the things that you brought up in the call, and I want to go there as well with your analysis there.
Sure. The United States Supreme Court has said that all racial classifications have to meet a standard that's called strict scrutiny. As defined a moment ago, it means the government action has to be necessary to achieve a compelling purpose. Over the last, now more than 30 years, the Supreme Court has allowed affirmative action programs by college universities saying it meets that standard. Cases like Regents the California versus Bakke in 1978, Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, Fisher versus University of Texas Austin in 2016, all said that college universities have a compelling interest in a diverse student body. Therefore, they may use race as one factor in admissions to benefit minorities. But the composition of the Supreme Court has changed greatly since 2016. 3 Trump appointees, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, joined the court. And I think now there's a court that's likely to overrule those decisions and find anything that looks like affirmative action to be unconstitutional. That's why, again, I urge this not be defined as affirmative action based on race, but instead as reparations based on lineage.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, just going back to the idea of indigenous Americans and lineage based protections, how do you think their claims or their historic claims parallel the Black American experience in this reparation space for the descendant community?
There are many injustices that were done to Native Americans. One of them was slavery.
Hmm.
There are many injustices done to Blacks. A horrible one was slavery. What I see reparations about is not dealing with all of the injustices that have been done to Native Americans or to Black Americans. It's about reparations for a particular horrific injustice, slavery. And I think if California were to adopt a law providing reparations to descendants of slaves, whether Native American or Black or of other races, I think that this is most likely to be upheld by the courts.
No, and that's really what we're looking for is trying to avoid any challenges of any programs or any proposals that come not only out of the state of California but also at the federal level
And it's
in
already
the court
started
system. It's
in
already started.
Evanston. If Evanston, which is a local reparations, even though in my opinion it's more of a home building voucher or a home purchase voucher is
Yeah,
what
it's not reparations.
Evanston's
Yeah.
program looks like to me. I wouldn't really call it reparations. It's also flattened to blackness. They really did not make criteria beyond being a Black Evanstonian, I guess is the right phrasing. And so the challenges like we're already seeing in real time. And so for us working in partnership with CJEC, which is Coalition for Just and Equitable California, it's a group of different varying grassroots organizations, including ours. One of the things that we really have been trying to help the task force hone in on is defining that beneficiary class. And there's been all kind of pushback.
Oh yeah.
And the lineage for us is like that is the key.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've said it here so plainly. I almost feel like it's too simple. But there has to be much more weight put to it. And so, what advice would you almost give the task force as they're having to make these criterion and establish the beneficiary class here in California?
There are two problems with focusing on lineage rather than race. One is all Blacks, even if they're not descendants of slavery, are individuals who have suffered because slavery existed in the United States. The tremendous disparity in wealth that exists in this country are, in the words of the Supreme Court, a badge and incident of slavery. And so I understand the view that since all Blacks have suffered because of the history of racism, all should be able to get reparations. The other problem is I've alluded to, and as you know, records were so incomplete. How are people going to be able to prove lineage?
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging those two issues and their importance, I'm saying if you look at what's likely to have a chance to be upheld in the courts,
Yes.
whatever you and I believe, I think if this is defined based on race, it's going to be deemed to violate Prop 209 and deemed to violate the US Constitution. So what I'm advising is to choose the approach, even if it's not perfect, that is the best chance of prevailing when it's
Absolutely.
challenged in court.
And yes, absolutely. That's what we are trying to do here is give ourselves the best chance of success and the best chance of reaching this end goal. So this is important information. First of all, Dean, has the task force here in California reached out to you because you need to deliver this information directly to them? Have you heard from them?
They were very kind. I was invited to testify on December 7th at the very time I have a meeting that's scheduled that is quite important for my law school and that can't be rescheduled.
Understood.
So I hope there'll be another opportunity to speak with them.
Or if there's a way to submit recorded testimony or written testimony.
I'd be glad to.
Absolutely, because this is information that this task force, as they deliberate on eligibility, they need to hear that not only is it important that we talk about eligibility to make sure we are targeting the correct groups with these programs and proposals of redress, but also giving us the best chance of success. And so going on a lineage basis, it exponentially, from what I'm hearing from you, increases our chances of success and increases our chances of avoiding challenges in the court for whatever comes out of this California body.
As I said, my goal is simply to be of help. And if I
Yes.
can be of help in doing recorded testimony or written testimony, I'd be glad to. I know the work is continuing, so I just want to be of assistance. I don't think what I'm saying to you is controversial among constitutional law professors or constitutional lawyers.
Yes.
I think any will tell you that anything that is defined in terms of race, whether that education, contract, and employment, preferences are going to be deemed invalid under Prop 209, and they're going to have very little chance of succeeding with this court. And so the key is to define this in a way that isn't about race.
Yes.
And I know it sounds silly because what we are talking about is the history of racial discrimination in the United States. But if we focus on going forward, what law could be enacted that has the greatest chance of succeeding in the courts in the future, I think, which I think will tell you, lineage rather than race is the way to define the class of beneficiaries.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also a challenge, honestly, with HR 40. The language in HR 40 is a little bit all over the place in terms of, African American.
Yeah.
There's language about the descendants of slaves. And so it kind of runs this gamut. But the intention, I know, particularly with the modern language that was put into HR 40, is this idea of sort of capturing all Black people. But Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, who is a commissioner on the California Task Force, he really hones in on harm. Who were the harmed classes? And I think when we start to take a step back and look at that on the federal level, I think that there is like no argument about the descendants who really have sort of been here 7 to 10 generations long and lived through all the different gyrations of American history. And I don't know how we could make a strong argument, to Sheila Jackson Lee out of Texas, who's the congressional sponsor for HR 40. Have you read any of HR 40 in the language in that Reparations Commission?
I have. Of course, it's just about a commission. The language is imprecise. What's crucial is that the language of any bill that would actually give reparations, define it so it's not about race. And I think that the example that is very powerful is after World War II, Japanese Americans who were interned
Yes.
were given reparations by the federal government.
Yes.
Not all Japanese Americans could get reparations, only those who were interned. Now, if others had been interned, they might have been able to make a claim for reparations, but it was specifically about giving reparations to people who had been subjected to a policy of the United States government.
Yes.
And I think that's what lineage-based reparations does. Slavery was a policy of the United States government.
Yes.
It was written into the Constitution in 1787. The institution of slavery was repeatedly upheld by the Supreme Court, enforced by act of Congress and acts of the president. And what this is doing is providing the descendants of the individuals who were enslaved reparations, much like the reparations after World War II provided to those who were interned.
Yes.
And slavery laws themselves were lineage based, right? If your mother was born enslaved and you were the child, regardless of who fathered you, you were born into slavery. And so for the repair and the redress to be lineage based when the harm itself was lineage based, I hate to oversimplify again, logically just makes crystal and clear sense. I want to switch here just a little bit to talk about Native American treaties and current modern awards in terms of compensation. There are different conversations that we within the reparations community have. Dr. Sandy Darity out of Duke University certainly has quantified valuations based on closing the racial wealth gap. We have Dr. Thomas Kramer coming out of University of Connecticut, who has just based on wages and I think 6% interest, his numbers are in the quadrillions. But I think that we could learn something in terms of indigenous treaties and compensation that has been received and renegotiated over time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. No compensation is going to be adequate.
Yes.
No compensation can completely eliminate the racial wealth gap. No compensation can ever erase the horrific things that were done to people long ago. But that doesn't deny that compensation can make a real difference in people's lives and also be a very important statement by the
Hmm.
United States government or the state of California. And there are many treaties with Native American tribes that have to be thought of in the context of reparations. And much the same, they're not going to make anybody whole. They're not going to be able to eliminate the horrors that were done, but they're still important to pursue.
Yes. I want to ask you a quick Constitution question, Dean.
Sure.
So, in the case of Japanese internment, their claim really was on a violation of the Constitution, as I understand it from John Tatieshi's book. Our claim is more so of how the Constitution was legally weaponized against us, right? So it as you just said, slavery in many cases legal, black codes legal, Jim Crow legal, in the prevailing law of the land. So my question is, what does this say about the American Constitution? Is that document still relevant or enforceable, or even should be something that we're looking towards?
First, the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus United States in 1944
Yes.
upheld the evacuation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and effectively their internment in what President Franklin Roosevelt called concentration camps.
Yes. Yes.
So the Constitution failed African Americans, people of African descent, early in American history and throughout American history. But the Constitution also failed those of Japanese descent in the
Good point.
1940s.
Good point. Absolutely.
The Constitution very much institutionalized slavery. Article 4, Section 2 had the Fugitive Slave Clause that said, if Article Section 3, rather, if a slave escaped from a slave state to a free state, the slave had to be returned as a piece of property. The Constitution said that Congress could not abolish the institution of slavery for 20 years, and it was one of the few provisions of the Constitution that couldn't be amended. Slaves were deemed three-fifths of a person. And we can go on with the provisions in the United States Constitution that very much protected the institution of slavery. And from 1787, when the Constitution was written, until 1865, when the 13th Amendment was adopted, and that's 78 years.
Yes.
Not one Supreme Court decision even chipped away at the institution of slavery. The key Supreme Court cases all protected the rights of slave owners. But then we get to your question about the Constitution today. As much as the Constitution was a slave document, it's also the law of the land. And it's also the Constitution that was used by Thurgood Marshall to
Yes.
forge Brown versus Board of Education. In the end of Jim Crow laws, it's the Constitution that we rely on to protect our most basic rights. So we can't ignore the fatal flaws in the Constitution that we had from the beginning. But the reality is, it's still the governing document that we have to live under and litigate under.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I always think the Constitution needs to be changed in a couple of places. So, so that's just me and my take on it. But we hear you loud and clear. Dean Cheraminsky, I'm wondering if there is any case law in particular that you think that the AB 3121 task force members or any other like municipalities, the city of LA is about to have a task force. Is there any case law in particular that you think they should be considering as they are, again, defining beneficiary classes, as they are looking to decide what kinds of repairs are appropriate? I think having that referenced and cataloged here in our show for people to come back to might be an asset long term.
Sure. In terms of the US Constitution, I would look carefully at a Supreme Court case called Wygant versus Jackson Board of Education. It involved the Jackson, Michigan school system that had recently hired a number of Black teachers when there needed to be layoffs. So it decided to fire white teachers with more seniority. And they said they were doing this because they were trying to remedy the broad history of race discrimination in the United States. They were doing this also because the importance of providing role models in a school system that was overwhelmingly Black. The Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional and flat out stated that the government can't use race to benefit minorities to remedy the general history of social discrimination. The Supreme Court has said that on many occasions. We can come up with all the reasons we want why that's wrong, why the government should be able to use race to remedy the history of discrimination. But that's not where the Supreme Court is. And that's why I think it's so important that whatever reparations are adopted not be defined based on race,
Yes.
but be defined in terms of lineage. In terms of the California Supreme Court, there's very few cases about Prop 209. The high voltage case is the most important, and it's an opinion by then Justice Janice Rogers Brown that broadly defines what Prop 209 prohibits and says that it even prohibits outreach on the basis of race. And so it's key in defining what's a preference. And again, to go back to where we started, I think it reinforces under Prop 209, if this is about education, contracting, and employment, it can't be based on race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. It makes perfect sense. And it's someplace that we've been for a while now. But hearing it from you and all of your years of experience, I think solidifies it for us and really makes it real. I had a quick question going back to Native American treaties, because part of what we're engaged in all the time, you heard Friday reference it, is trying to determine what is the number, right? What is the compensation number and how do we properly, there is no compensation that makes up for all of what we have been subjected to. But as we talk about the compensation for Native Americans and what came out of those treaties, could you talk a little bit about the evolution of that? Because it wasn't just a one number and we're done sort of thing, if I understand correctly. And I believe you quoted some case law, also Native American case law, in our conversation earlier. So I just wanted to open it up on that subject of compensation for any thoughts that you have.
Sure. And let me be clear, economists will need to advise you in terms
Absolutely.
of how to measure the compensation.
We got a pretty
I
good
feel
one
it's
in Sandy
constitutional law.
Darity. We got a pretty good one in Sandy Darity. Absolutely.
And the reality is your political experts will tell you what's politically viable in terms of the numbers. I can just talk about what's constitutional. In terms of the Native American treaties, I think one thing to remember is there's not a single treaty that
Yes.
provides reparations.
Yes.
There's treaties with many different Native American tribes, and they provide many different forms of reparations. And you'll need to study and see if there are some that are more applicable to what you're looking for. But I think as you do, it's key that it wasn't one treaty with all Native Americans at one point in time. And so in this sense, I think there's probably going to be, if it can get adopted, one bill through Congress, one bill through the state legislature. I don't know that it's going to be a whole series of them. Maybe, but at this stage, just getting one adopted would be a huge accomplishment.
Agreed.
And this is a little bit of a random question, but oftentimes when I may be speaking to reparations and repair, I'll take a look at France and Haiti. And I look at that only because there's often we can't trace, and like you said here today, how do you find the records? I'm usually like the Mormons have pretty good records, the Church of Latter-day Saints. However, I think it was 182 years that France collected to the descendant families of the slave owners who ultimately lost, their slave holdings in Haiti. But it was financed and it took that long to sort of pay the debt back, the 182 years. And so oftentimes, we'll talk about repair. And I think that, 200 years, 182 years, is a significant amount of time. I certainly think here in the United States, obviously the harm lasted that long. But when you are talking ultimately about proposals and negotiating them and including things like the education, employment, contracting, small business loans, I mean, we can go on, defense contracts, we can kind of go on and on. But do you think that it is actually reasonable in terms of time? Because compensation to me is one thing, and then there's a portfolio of benefits that need to last over a duration of time. What is your analysis just on, I don't know, expectations and like that 182-year mark that happened in France and Haiti's case of the payback?
I think there's several questions here. One is, what are the records like? Will it be possible to people to prove lineage if this is lineage based? And again, that's not my expertise, but I think that it is a crucial question if it's going to be pursued along lineage lines. What
Yes.
will be necessary for somebody to prove that they're entitled to the benefits? You want to have it be sufficiently generous in the definition that people will be able to take advantage of it, but not so unlimited that it's not geared towards and not focused on the people who should be able to get the
Yes.
reparations.
Yes.
Second, in terms of the time period, slavery officially ended in 1865. So if I'm doing my math right, that was 156 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how long the reparation should continue, but people have been suffering the effects of slavery since it ended, and of course, all the time that it existed. So, to me, that's a practical question of
Yes.
how can you best provide reparations based on lineage? How will you define who's entitled? What benefits will they get for what period of time? If those are the questions, then you're beyond the constitutional mention. Now you're just how to make the program work.
That's right. Implementation. We're in the
Yeah.
execution at that
And
point. Yeah.
implementation, I think, will be the biggest thing. I mean, we look back at Tulsa, Oklahoma had a commission. They made recommendations
Yep.
and they were never implemented. And
Yep.
so I always do try to explore, like, what does that practically look like, as you're saying? Because I think at times when you talk about the Black American experience, I think sometimes it feels so big and ominous to people that they just would rather, like, we can't deal with it. But I always get back to a Callie House, who I think what she did in her day, immediately following, the Civil War, the fact that she was able to have 30,000 people across the South who were formerly enslaved, paying into the pension, learning about how they should be fighting against the United States government, and then just sort of being dismissed via mail fraud of all things. It's an important conversation for us to keep kind of coming back to. It's an important one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Dean, you have kind of covered it for me here. I'm trying to see if I have any more questions for you, but you were just as clear as you were in our lead up call when we reached out to you for your assistance in this and trying to wrap our minds around it. Not an attorney here, so it helps to have the legal perspective, especially the constitutional perspective. As we think about equal protection as a obstacle at the federal level, what recommendations would you have for us? And we understand lineage is the basis, but are there any other pitfalls or any other obstacles that we should be aware of, just in your professional opinion?
Sure. The Supreme Court has consistently said since 1978 that the government can't engage in programs that are race-based to benefit minorities in response to the general history of race discrimination in society. There's no point in butting your head against that wall.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so important that this not be defined as a race-based program, as remedy for the long history of discrimination, because the Supreme Court has said it won't accept it.
Yep.
Second, keep in mind that the cases that have held affirmative action since 1978 all are now vulnerable with a very different and much more conservative court. So the temptation to maybe try to gear something around what the Supreme Court has upheld in Bakke, Grutter, and Fisher may not get you very far with a court that's not going to respect those as precedent.
That's a
So
good point.
what you have is a court right now that is very hostile to anything that's going to look like an affirmative action program based on race.
Yes, that's a great point. That's a great point.
And this is I don't know, also another maybe random, I don't know, we'll see. I'm enjoying your answer, so I'm just trying to go for it here. Back in the 1800s, let's say the 1880s, I think there were maybe 50, 60 million Americans living here in the United States. And today, I think the number is like 326 or 327 million, which is a significantly more in terms of population and people. However, we are also at a time where numerically, I think the statistic is maybe 27% of Americans now are for reparations, which is like the highest percentage that has ever existed, despite the fact that there's so many more people. And I'm just wondering, with that data point, what advice you might have in terms of, I don't know, garnering more support around it. I mean, I know you're coming from a legal space, but I definitely think that the numbers matter. The fact that there is a national support for the bill and it's changing across the country. I'm just wondering, what do you think could be done to either grow that number or to move the needle, or how?
And I've got a similar. Let me piggyback on that. In your spaces, in your legal spaces, Dean, are these conversations occurring?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Around reparations, around the importance of lineage, specifically for the Black community. Are you having? Because you said to any kind of constitutional, expert, this is kind of a clear-cut case. I'm just wondering if these conversations are occurring in legal circles that we might not have visibility to, which goes kind of into Friday's question of raising awareness and what do you think additionally we could do on an awareness perspective.
Yes, the conversations are occurring, though obviously not with the intensity that you're focusing on it. As an example, when I teach equal protection in constitutional law, I focus a great deal on the programs that the Congress adopted after the Civil War that today we might think of as reparations or certainly as race conscious programs, things like the Freedmen's Bureau that existed then. And I do think if this is ever litigated on racial terms, it'll be important to argue to the conservative justices that this really is what Congress had in mind back in 1868.
Yeah.
So that's talked about. I have colleagues like John Powell, who I think you know, who's focused a great deal on this. My final exam question in my constitutional law class last spring was exactly what we're talking about now.
Oh, I like
in terms
that.
of the constitutionality of a reparations program. I did not define it on the basis of lineage, but on the basis of race. And the way the program was set up was because it's so difficult for people of lineage, and because all who are Black have suffered the effects of slavery, all should be able to benefit, and whether this would be constitutional or not. So yes, it's there. In terms of what can be done to increase support, again, I'm a constitutional law professor. I'm not an expert on anything like that. I think here, the racial reckoning that occurred after the death of George Floyd is so important to build on. People aren't aware of the tremendous gap in wealth, in income, solely on the basis of race, and how much that ties to the legacy of slavery.
Yes.
And so I think some of what has to be done is educating people.
100%. 100%. And we're going to talk a lot about that with our next guest here, the author of Redress. Education has to be central. Dean, thank you once again just for making yourself available to us and sharing your wisdom and your insight. It's not often, I can't think of anybody else I've spoken to that's argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So it just in that, thank you for lending your expertise, your insights, your wisdom to us. We firmly agree with you. Lineage-based reparations is the pathway. And I'm sure we're going to be reaching out to you when we get those challenges and when we're trying to prepare for any potential challenges for further insight and for further advice. So thank you again.
Thank you. I admire your work, and just let me know how I can be of help to you.
Absolutely. Well, number one, we got to get your testimony to the task force. And then when the HR 40 commission comes around, we're going to want to see you there as well.
Yes, sir.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
You too.
All right.
I think that settles it.
I mean,
for me, that settles
look,
it. That settles it.
Dean Chemerinsky made it so plain that it's almost like, it's a wrap. We got it in the first.
I hope the task force I hope members are watching this. I hope y'all just took that in. I hope you're listening to what he just told us. We're trying to give ourselves the best chance to win here. This is a consideration that we have to take. And what we're hearing is that if we go on race, 209 stands in the way. Equal protection, the 14th Amendment stands in the way. And we then set ourselves up for challenges in the court system that could invalidate anything that we get done as far as work here on the ground.
And that has been
it's got to be lineage.
That's been a primary driver of the Fix HR 40 campaign. I mean, it's almost like whether you want to hear it or not, the idea that it's a one size fits all is not going to be sustainable. It's not according to the law here in this country. We don't have any other laws that we can go on. And so we also, in terms of crafting this, have to be smart in our understanding of what the law is so that we do not craft something that can be kicked out. And then we're back into this sort of emotional tailspin of, well, why didn't this work? Well, it was crafted to fail.
That's right.
And so we want to be very purposeful in crafting legislation in the reparations space that is going to stand up to legal scrutiny.
Absolutely.
And even if it is challenged, it has the ability to win under challenge. And that, I think, has to be, you don't build the car with just the beginning in mind. You build the car with the ending in mind. And if you stay with that kind of construction, we will win this thing. And I think our next guest has the ability to even hone on this more.
He's because
some of what during that Japanese internment and the Japanese commission, and ultimately when it came down to handing down the repair, we're going to explore with our next guest the process that the Japanese Americans actually had to undertake in order to define who their beneficiary class was. And we have to take these opportunities to learn from when we say, oh, the Jewish folks got reparations from Germany and from the train companies. Oh, Japanese Americans got reparations, as Chemerinsky said. Indigenous people received what could be called reparations. We have to understand what that looks like so that, again, when we are crafting, we have an understanding of what our end goal is. And that's a major driver.
I couldn't have said it any better, Friday. Like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Somebody better be hitting the Venmo or the Cash App or something.
They are. Thank you.
$NAASDLA.
They totally are. We had XX sister, Fat X. Thank you so much. We saw you coming across the screen today, and we appreciate your contribution, especially on the back end of Thanksgiving. We know.
Yeah. And just real quickly, anybody out there who's Pan-Africanist, this is not an indictment on you. We're just trying to get this done. And Pan-Africanism in this legislation, in this bill, HR 40 and AB 3121, that sets us up to fail. That's not what anyone wants to do. So with that, we got to take a break. We're going to be back in 1 minute, 2 minutes. Stick with us, fam. We'll coming right back.
So if you were to bring the black share of wealth at least to the black share of the population, it would require an additional at least $10 trillion.
What's happening, Freedman family? We are back from our break, and what you just saw during that break was an outstanding trailer for a new documentary coming out of the ETM, Amend the Mass Media Group in Northern California. they're working hard up there, and they're putting out some media messages that need to be out there for the awareness that we were talking about in the last segment. We're about to get more into that.
And yes, and you can they have a GoFundMe.
GoFundMe, yep. Hit
campaign,
the GoFundMe.
Yes.
Yep.
And support their efforts.
Absolutely. And while you're supporting them, like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. You know what I say. Do that too.
Share it with your family members. This is an all hands on deck.
Absolutely. So we're going into the second segment here. We're going to talk about redress.
Yes.
So I'm going to let you bring them in.
Oh, me. Okay. So listen, we have with us author John Tateishi. And John is 2.5 years. He was 2.5 years old at the outbreak of World War II. He was forced with his family from their house in Los Angeles and sent to the so-called Manzanar Relocation Center internment camp. So John studied English literature at UC Berkeley and attended UC Davis for graduate studies. In 1975, he became involved with the redress program of the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, the nation's oldest and largest Asian American civil rights organization, and the author of the book Redress, which Chad has read.
Not the whole thing. I'm working my way. I'm working my way through it.
The inside story of the successful campaign for Japanese American reparations. We are so honored to have Mr. John Tateishi here with us today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's a real honor to be here, a real privilege.
Well,
thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here, sir. And as Friday said, I picked up your book because I wanted to read it. I was, kind of sort of familiar with the Japanese internment process and the process of redress. But your book, I got to say, he goes into the details behind the scenes and gives us the whole story of what actually occurred from 1970 through 1988, I believe, when the Civil Liberties Act was signed by Reagan. And it is incredible to read because not only are you giving up kind of like the secrets of the sauce, right? But at the same time, I'm reading and I'm like, that's happening now. Like we're going through this right now. And it's so many parallels. So I wanted to have you here just to talk about these interconnected movements and these interconnected claims and how you as the director of that campaign and director of JACL ultimately, but also the lead of that redress campaign, how you got to that point of success, because that's the key word to me here, successful campaign. So if you could just start us out at the very beginning as you do in the book, how did you come to the reparations or the redress movement for Japanese Americans?
Well, one of the things you both pointed out, and Dean
Chemerinsky. I had trouble too. It's okay.
Sorry, everyone has trouble with my name, so I know what that feels like. But what all three of you were talking about at one point was education.
Yes.
You look at Black slavery in America versus what happened to us during World War II. And it's clear that the differences are so significant. I mean, throughout the whole episode of our campaign, I never once felt that a comparison could be made between what happened to Black slaves in America and what happened to us. Ours was, in some ways, the parallels worked more closely up to a very short point with what happened to Jews in Europe. That is, an ethnic group that was forced by government policy to undergo imprisonment. And in their case, I mean, that's where it ends for us.
Yes.
Because we were in concentration camps, barbed wire, enclosed camps with guard towers. But there was nothing that even hinted at the kinds of things that went on in Europe. We weren't in labor camps. We were not in death camps. Mm-hmm. These were concentration camps where we were detained. We were held as prisoners. To try to compare what happened to us with Black slaves in America is such a huge difference. Yes. That there are a lot of pitfalls, but in some ways, perhaps what we did with the campaign would help inform some of the thinking in the current Black reparations movement. Yeah. We started out very, very far behind the eight ball when it came to trying to run a political campaign. Japanese Americans were very apolitical in many ways, partly because of what happened, or largely because of what happened to us during World War II. So there was this real resistance to getting involved with anything confronting the government or anything in politics. But the organization I belonged to was a civil rights organization, the Japanese American Citizens League. So you get a different breed of members going into that. They were not typical of Japanese Americans. There wasn't any kind of hesitation on the part of JACL members to push political issues. That's what we were there for. You know, that's what you do when you're in a civil rights group. But you know, the thing about our situation was that nobody knew what happened to us. There were people in California during World War II who didn't know about it. It was such a well-kept secret. I mean, it didn't get a lot of publicity. It did get some. It was in the news, you know, the war propaganda news. And so, but it was in the news as a way to justify what the government was doing to us. It wasn't there to explain that there was a social issue taking place here. There's a whole history of antagonism towards people who are Asian in America. Started with the Chinese immigrants, brought here as cheap labor, and they face horrendous situations here in San Francisco, largely, but also down in Los Angeles, up in Seattle. They worked in the gold mines on railroads and did a lot of menial labor. But they faced a lot of discrimination about 40, 50 years after the immigration of Japanese farmers started immigrating to the United States. And the difference was that the Japanese immigrants were looking for land. And, you know, being farmers, they wanted land to work. And in a sense, that was what planted their roots in this country, was that they had these farms. By 1941, a lot of the farms in the Central Valley were owned by Japanese American farmers. And they had a monopoly on the truck farming industry throughout the Central Valley, which was one of the most fruitful and productive areas in this country, and producing all kinds of produce for the country. So you had, on the one hand, grange associations and farmers against us, realtors against us, and this built-in anti-Asian sentiment looking at us as a threat to the well-being of mainstream Americans, of white Americans, because we were establishing ourselves in this country and we didn't look like them. And so when the war broke out,
sorry to interrupt you. I want to stay there real quick though, because there was this division between the Japanese American community and the mainstream community, but there was also a lot of internal division. And so when I talk about the parallels I see, I just want to, and I've been practicing these names, the Issei, that's first generation immigrants. So those were Japanese citizens who were denied by federal mandate naturalization here in America. Then you had the Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans born between about 1910 and 1930 to immigrant parents, and they made up the majority of that Japanese American Citizens League, right? So, and they were I've heard it described as I think in your book, the wall of silence is where, with the Nisei, really that lay, where there was no real discussion of internment or camp with the future generation, the Sansei, which I believe you are part of, even though you were born prior to the war. And so that when I was reading that, I immediately came to our own community and what we see as far as gatekeepers from an older generation that are out of, I think, very much out of a sense of shame, just similarly as the Nisei, are reticent to really pick up and say, yes, reparations are due and we're going to stand in this fight for reparations, out of that same sort of sense of shame that same sort of sense of, you know, we're not going to ask the government for anything. We're going to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, etc. So I saw a real parallel there between the generational divides in the Japanese American community at the start of this process and what we now see in the Black community as far as generational divides. Could you
Yeah,
talk a
and
little bit about that?
that's exactly what happened to us because the Nisei, who were American citizens, did not believe this would happen to them, that they would actually be forced into prisons, but it did happen. Every person who had at least 50% Japanese blood was put into these prisons. So when the war ended, the Nisei couldn't talk about it. Culturally, it led to a lot of complications, but just in general, of facing their white neighbors who would look at us and say, well, you were prisoners. You must have done something wrong. And the worst thing you can be labeled during time of war is traitor.
Yes.
So the Nisei built this wall of silence around the community. And it wasn't until their children born after World War II started going to college in the 50s and 60s that they started hearing professors talk about, in history classes, talk about the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, not as a negative thing, but more like, oh, and by the way, we put Japanese Americans in these relocation centers for their own protection. And a lot of these young students, that was the first time they had ever heard this. So they started calling their parents and asking, you know, what was this all about? And they started to find out more and more and got angrier and angrier.
Yes.
And so there was in the Japanese community a resistance by the older generation, now the Nisei, who were teenagers and in the early 20s during World War II, were now the seniors, the elders of the community. And they held all the power, they held all the influence.
Yes.
They said, this is shameful. We will not do this. We will not support this.
And I think, you know, in the African American experience, I had the privilege of living well into adulthood with my great grandmother, and there was shame from her existence, and it was her grandmother who was enslaved here in the United States. And yet, in the same way, that was just something that was not talked about. It was something that was looked at with shame. And now we are like, you know, I'm what, 2 generations removed from my great grandmother. And for us, we look at it in terms of, no, how strong you were, how you survived, you know, how we are still here. And it's just interesting to me how the different generations kind of perceive the same experiences or family folklore or family history and look at it differently and experience it differently. But those were also a traumatized people because they lived through the actual experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have on top of that what happened to them, the treatment they had to go through. And you know, you get pounded down enough and you do become very second class in your own thinking, that you're not as good as those people who control you because they have all the power. And for us, it wasn't so much that as the sense of we were second class because we were not allowed our freedom. And after the war, we didn't feel that we had achieved our place in this country yet. So what happened was that it was the Sansei who pushed for the exposure of the facts, the truth of what this was all about. It was the Nisei who resisted all of that and wanted to just leave it behind. You know, we had gone, there's this Japanese word, shikataganai, which is don't dwell on what you cannot change. Leave the past in the past, live in the moment. It's a very Zen kind of thing. So it was the Nisei who wanted to just in silence, leave it behind, let us work our way back into society. So for us with this campaign, it became an issue internally in the community of resolving the conflicts between different groups. I mean, there were a number of different groups that were really opposed and angry at each other for the various positions they took. And within
that is also happening now today.
I believe in the book
within our HR 40. It's very interesting some days.
Yeah, I believe in the book you said even the pro reparations groups didn't agree, right?
Huge disagreements.
Yes.
Very bitter, very angry kinds of disagreements. But you know, sometimes you get lucky and you make decisions that bring everyone else behind you screaming and hollering. And if you're lucky in that sense of finding the right strategy, then suddenly people begin to realize, oh, this might work.
Yes.
And then you start to get a coalescing of the different views. And that happened to us because of this federal commission. We saw it as a strategy. But the only reason we did the commission was because I realized Americans had no idea that this had happened to us, and that we needed to educate the American public of the injustice of what happened
Yep.
before we could get the Congress to support anything we were attempting.
Yep.
When we first got into this when we launched this as a public campaign in 1978, the majority of members of Congress thought what happened to us was perfectly fine. It was the right thing to do given the circumstances. And basically they were saying, the hell with the Constitution. The Constitution can't apply in times of crises. And so for us, the education was to inform the public and the Congress about what happened, why it was so wrong, and how it was an abrogation of the Constitution.
Yeah.
What you're facing is a completely different thing because, who doesn't know about slavery?
You would be surprised, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, there are a lot of people who deny it.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But you've mentioned the Darity Mullen book, and that's a really good informational book about
Absolutely.
what the history is. And for us, a lot of it came down to our having to know and understand for ourselves what we had experienced and why it happened to us, what we didn't understand about it. And as we started researching it more and more, we started learning more and more how badly we got screwed by the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so we started focusing our attention on the public and telling them, this is what happened, here's why it's wrong. And we just insisted this was a constitutional issue. When you get to an issue that steps outside of that bound, like slavery, because it becomes really much more complicated, because you have a constitution that allowed for this. And but in our case, we could define it by the Constitution. And we had to believe in ourselves and our ability to overcome everything this was going to make us face. When we started the campaign, nobody, and I mean not a single person in this country, thought we had a chance in hell.
So
because
that was way before the internet. So how do you take these stories and get them to the American people? Like,
Yeah.
what was even that process like? We have talked to certain institutions, certain schools, colleges about that. In this HR 40 space, how do we engage community and invite community in to really understand what the HR 40 conversation and reparations for Black Americans is like? But this is a day where we have social media, which is something you did not have. So how did you even begin to invite the American public into your fight?
And if I could add on to that, it really was the Nisei voice that you were trying to bring to the forefront as the group that directly experienced this, right? And
yeah, that's precisely how that strategy had to work. I knew that we could not win this fight without the Nisei support and the Nisei voice. And so what our strategy was to look at this commission, federal commission, and what it could achieve for us. It would hold hearings, it could issue an official report, and it could issue recommendations. It would be the official study of the United States government about the circumstances that led to what happened to us and the conclusions about those decisions made to do that. But in the earlier stages of it, before we ever got to that point, I realized the best medium we had were newspapers and radio. Television was kind of iffy still in those days. You know, there weren't a lot of those 3-hour talk programs on television. You had those on radio, and that's what I targeted. And we also, one thing I did was I sent out press releases to all the major media outlets. And, you know, and this was not in the days of computers. I mean, in some ways, I'm glad we didn't have social media. And, you know, I think it could have worked really very strongly against us.
Yes.
Because, you know, to white America, there is that old thing, you know, like the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Well, there was that same parallel. The only good Jap is a dead Jap. And so that's what we faced.
Yeah.
And so what I started doing is sending press releases to the major media in this country, and they would run, usually at the beginning, they would run editorials against us to say, this is why it's wrong. And we do not support this. We think they need to just basically just, you know, be good people and just go away. And so what that did was open up the avenue of those letters to the editor.
Yes.
And we had people, you know, the JSL had chapters all over the country.
Yes.
We had 113 chapters, although most were in California. We'd had them spread out in the Midwest and East Coast. So we would arm them with fact sheets and draft editorials, draft letters. And as soon as they saw something appear in the media, they would write something. They would respond to it. And it was our way of starting the debate. We needed that debate, and we would not have been able to do this without that debate in the public arena. And that's why I went after the media, and I thought the media is the best place to do it.
Yes.
And the talk shows, I mean, a program like yours would have been worth its weight in gold, you know, a chance to face an audience, and especially if they called in.
Yeah.
Because most of the calls were very negative and angry. And it gave me a chance to respond to that anger and to try to explain why they were so misinformed, how they were dealing with information that came from propaganda and mythology. And so, you know, it had to be a concentrated effort, which is what we did for the first year and a half,
Absolutely.
2 years, until this federal commission started its process. Honestly, I was opposed to a commission concept.
Yes.
I was deadly opposed to it because I thought, you know, commissions don't accomplish anything. They study, they write a report, no one reads it, and you waste 2 years. But we worked with this commission really closely in making sure that didn't happen. What was important to me was the idea that we would have public hearings. That is, it would provide the Nisei the chance to testify, to tell their story. You know, you have now this concept of truth and reconciliation, the truth telling. That wasn't around in those days. There were no models for us. This was kind of like, you know, throw it on the wall and see what works and sticks and evaluate it. And to me, the idea of giving the Nisei an opportunity to testify, to tell their story, their personal story, was the most important part of anything we could do.
Yes.
And as it turned out, that was what changed public opinion. As they saw this on the news every night while these hearings were going on, the stories were heartbreaking. And these stories were really getting at the truth of what America stood for.
Yes.
And so that became a really important part of the strategy.
Yes.
Once we had that commission come out with its report and its recommendation, we were able to codify all these different points of view and say, look, you know, and that is within our own community. And to say that here is what we, the JACL, are going to do. We have accepted the commission's recommendations of $20,000, and we are going to put their recommendation into legislation, and that is what will drive the final part of this campaign, which in the end lasted 2 years.
Yes.
But one of the really difficult parts we faced, that I faced, was Who's eligible? How do you
Yes.
Yeah.
define what reparations is all about?
Read my mind.
And who qualifies to be part of that? I've talked with Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen about this,
Yes.
and also about also to Charles Henry about this. And it's really a difficult issue
Yes.
within this whole the framework of what slavery is all about, and how do you carry that through to a reparations movement.
Yes.
You do it by lineage. I mean, there's all the arguments for that. But then I also think about, okay, but if you're not a direct descendant of a slave, then what happens to the people, the blacks who went through Jim Crow for so many years, so many decades?
Mm-hmm.
What about that? Because in some ways that was as bad as what they had to go through as slaves. And I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
But this is one of those things where I think, as the dean said, you have to define it and cut your losses. You're not going to be able to make everybody happy. You're not going to be able to satisfy a lot of people, but you use your best judgment possible, and you define what you're trying to achieve with this.
Yeah.
Is it money? Is it justice? And then how do you define all of those things? I mean, if you take the Darity Mullen formula, you're talking about 11 to 13 trillion dollars.
Yeah. On the low end. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and it could go much, much higher than that.
John.
But if you talk about the income disparity because of race,
Mm-hmm.
that's a kind of formula that it seems to me makes a lot of sense. But you put the number way up there, and you're facing certain political obstacles.
John, I'd like to dig a little bit more into that eligibility question, because what we're talking about were the Japanese Latinos that were transported into some of those camps during the time of internment. And
Right.
I read in the book how, that was a gut-wrenching decision, but that decision was made to give the redress campaign the best chance at success. So looking at it in totality, the decision was made so that redress could move forward and not, die. Because I believe there was a congressperson that told you, you're never going to get a vote for this because there are people here who aren't citizens. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the whole campaign was based on constitutionality and citizenship, and for those who were not allowed to become naturalized citizens, the Issei, but were here as legal resident aliens.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a constitutional right to be here. What started happening as I lobbied for this, I mean, just the beginning, the commission bill, and in those days, almost every member of Congress, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, were lawyers. They had law backgrounds, and most of them had been prosecutors. And so what started happening was I would go through a lot of the negatives out there. I targeted Republicans because they were the hard cases, and to try to change their thinking. And I started running into members of Congress who would say, "Oh, but this doesn't apply only to Constitution and citizenship because they're non-citizens." I thought they were talking about the Issei, and then one of them brought up this idea of, well, there were people from South America who were in a camp in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't, and if you include them, then I'm not going to vote for this bill. That became a really tough decision for us.
Yeah.
We were looking at the numbers and what this would do. And we had 4 members of Congress who were Japanese American.
The Big Four, yeah.
And who we call the Big Four, right? Danny Noah and Spark Matsunaka from Hawaii, Norm Mineta, who is from San Jose, member of the House, and Bob Matsui, who was brand new to the Congress at the time. All 4 of them said, we can't get this passed if we include what we call the JLA, Japanese Latin Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And so we looked at the numbers, and if you look at 120,000 versus the roughly 5,000 who were brought here, and the question put to me is, are you going to jeopardize this for everyone else? and include the JLAs, because if you are, we'll support that. But I just want you to know it's going to make it much, much harder.
Yeah.
And you probably won't get it to pass.
Yeah.
And just from what I was experiencing, that became a real point where we had to make a decision. It was the first really hard decision. And we decided, for the greater good of the larger numbers, we had to get our redress effort through first. And if we succeeded, we would turn around and come right on the tail of that.
Absolutely.
With a bill for the JLAs. And this was a JACL obligation to do that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And it became a different issue. But quite honestly, as I thought about eligibility, and I'm meeting with these 4 members of Congress talking about eligibility, who's going to be included and who's not, even within the Japanese American community, there was so much disagreement among different groups about who shouldn't be included because so-and-so didn't go to war with us. And, there were these conflicts. And the only way I saw to get past all those personal things, personal obstacles, was to define it by basically experience. To say anyone who was living in what was at that time called the military zone, Washington, the entire states of Washington, Oregon, California, and the western half of Arizona. Excuse me. If you're a Japanese American living in the military zone and were affected by the government's orders, which started on, we put December 7th as a starting date, through to the end of the war and beyond that, because one of the camps stayed open for a year beyond the end of the war against Japan. So we, made the dates open, but we defined it by experience, and you had to have been Japanese American. Yeah. There's the problem of what about wives who followed, white wives who followed the Japanese husbands into the camps with their kids? And those things really complicated the issue. But what I found was that we had to really define everything, like who would be eligible, how do you make that definition, and what is it exactly we're trying to achieve here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is it only money, or is there more to this that we want to accomplish as a way of preventing it from ever happening again?
Yeah. Clearly defining the issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's critical, and that's really difficult. It's not an easy decision to come to. There'll be all kinds of disagreements about that.
We did have an audience question. They wanted to know if America and Japan's relationship post-war, because they wound up becoming allies, help your cause in any way.
That was a midst of a trade war, wasn't it, John, at the time?
Yeah. Japan became an ally of the United States, but what happened was that by the 1980s, there was a trade war between Japan and the United States, and it became a really ugly war in which Japan was winning hand over fist. Every television in American homes was practically a Japanese. Most of them were Japanese built. All these cars that were on the streets, on the roads in America in the 1980s. Majority were Japanese. And so there was this really ugly trade war going on. And, that would be brought up constantly about how we won the war, we helped Japan, and now look at the thanks we get.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you end up dealing with a lot of extraneous things that are going to matter in the end.
Yeah, John. And you were critical in kind of forming that strategy as as a committee head within the JACL. And as I read it, there were really 2 tenets, and we talked about education a little bit. But that education campaign would then shape the legislative strategy. And you talked about how you initially were not on board with the commission bill, but after the meeting of the Big Four, commission bills seemed to be the correct pathway to get anything done. I think one of the congressmen said, he would lose his job or something like that if you went with the direct appropriation sort of bill. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the JACL strategy of precedent, because that, again, it drew a very stark parallel to me in what we are attempting to do, particularly here in the state of California with the AB 3121 task force, the California Reparations Task Force, in setting precedents for the federal government. Could you talk a little bit about the precedent strategy?
Well, the members of Congress I talked most with were Senator Inoue, Dan Inoue, and at the time Congressman Norm Mineta, in dealing with strategy. And one of the things we talked about was that if we're able to achieve something with this commission, even if we don't get to the final goal of getting monetary compensation, what we would do is open a door that no one wanted to even look at. And quite honestly, the majority of members of Congress I dealt with in trying to get that commission bill passed, who were opposed to it, would say, well, you know, if we approve this for Japanese Americans, where you have what now, like maybe 90,000, 100,000. Think of what will happen if we set that precedent.
Yeah. They were scared of black reparations or black
Yeah,
American
I mean, that's
reparations.
exactly what they were looking at. And I would often say when they said that, is that, well, you need to look at that.
Yes.
I mean, this country will not heal itself from that whole episode until you look at it honestly. But they were afraid of it, that if Japanese Americans got money, look at the numbers coming behind them. And, you know, incidentally, after 9/11, the Congress, a lot of members of Congress talked about doing exactly the same thing to Arabs and Muslims as they did to Japanese Americans. And I pointed out in the work I was doing after 9/11, pointed out to members of Congress who would say, well, we need to do the same thing. I would point out they're saying exactly about Arabs and Muslims as they were saying about Japanese Americans. We don't know them, they're exotic, they dress different, they speak this different language, all of that. But not a single piece of evidence of wrongdoing to warrant what they were saying. And I said, you know, and this was like 8 years later, after the redress bill had passed. And I would say to them, you know, there were 80,000 of us still around when the redress bill passed who were eligible for compensation. It costs the government over $2 billion. There are over 4 or 5 million Arab and Muslims in this country. And I would tell them there's not enough money in this country to do what you're talking about. And when they come back at you with reparations for the wrong, they're American citizens and you're doing exactly the same thing. So, I mean, you know, you do the numbers and it's terrifying for members of Congress, especially those who don't even want to talk about these issues. But, you know, this is an issue that needs to be discussed, that needs to be debated. It's the only way we're going to become healthy as a nation. And until we do that, this will be a burden this country will carry for as long as it avoids the issue. It's going to happen at some point. It has to.
Absolutely.
Reparations heals the nation.
Could not agree more. John, just one more question before we have to get out of here, and my producers are telling me to wrap here. So when we talk about support, you had internal division based on generational differences. There was internal organizational differences between reparations groups in the Japanese American community. But then when you looked externally, you didn't have a lot of support from other national organizations. So in the book, you mentioned that the Chinese American Civil Rights Organization said something like their constituency would turn against them if they were actually to support redress for Japanese Americans. Wow. You didn't get any support. You know, we all have kind of seen the speech by Ron Dellums before the Civil Liberties Act was signed, but you didn't get initial support from the ACLU or the NAACP. It actually was the Jewish community that was first to step up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I had a good friend here in San Francisco who was the director of the Bay Area branch of the American Jewish Committee, who incidentally suggested to me the idea of a commission. And I told him where to take that. You know, I was so opposed to that. But as we moved this campaign into the public arena, he offered to get the AJC's endorsement. And, I welcomed it. But quite honestly, I had no idea the significance of that endorsement because the AJC, I found out that it's like the NAACP, they're NAA, I'm sorry. There are a lot of members of Congress who were not Jewish, who had AJC memberships because they were such an influential and powerful organization. And there was a lot of money to be had from them. And in the same way, the NAA has members of Congress, a lot of members who are not African American, because it's the way they show support and respect for the community. And, and it's also a very political thing. So we had the AJC support, and the second support we had, endorsement, was the Presbyterian ministries. I thought, well, this is a soft endorsement, but we would take whatever we could.
Yeah.
And until the lobbyists in Washington, she and I were having lunch one day, and she said, well, let me tell you what this means. We will send a directive to every minister, Presbyterian minister in the country, and urge them to talk about this issue. And I thought, my God, you start spreading this through the churches, that's a whole different matter.
Yes.
And it became a very important endorsement for us. So we had two important organizations supporting us, but they were the only ones initially. And it wasn't until the commission bill passed and the hearings were held and we had finally a reparations bill in the Congress that we started getting other groups starting to support us. But they didn't come in at the very beginning. It was more of keeping distance, watching and seeing what happened. I dare say with Black reparations, you're going to get every major civil rights organization behind this. And it's important you do. It's important you get a lot of other communities to support this. And, I do know that the Japanese American community is very strongly in support.
Yeah. We need you to talk to the Chinese American community for us.
Maybe
I'll just leave it there.
That was in the days when we didn't talk to each other much. You had Chinatown, you had J-Town. You stay in your place, we'll stay in ours. And we're fine. Because the old cultural baggage was there. But that's not true anymore. We've gotten wiser, we've gotten younger, and that changed everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, happy after Thanksgiving. This has certainly been insightful and a learning experience for us, and you've shared so much. And folks, you can go ahead and support John's book, which is entitled Redress. Yeah, we have it here on the
thank you.
On the table. So that you can learn about that experience and share and grow in our own education in this reparation space. I don't think we have any more questions, but this has really, really been insightful.
And John, please stay connected with us as we go. I'm learning so much from your book. You were in the political mud and you were in the fight. So I'm learning from that because that's squarely where we are. We're in the fight. Please stay connected with us as we continue down this pathway. I'd like to see you in front of the AB 3121 task force. I'd like to see you in front of the HR 40 commission. I'd like to see
on the commission
speaking about your experiences in the redress campaign and ultimately how you were able to get to that keyword success.
I'm happy to do what I can to help. It's an important issue for this country. It needs to be dealt with.
Yes.
And by the way, you have a really good guy coming up next on this.
He said the same thing about you. So the checks must be clearing, right? The checks are flying.
Yeah. I mean, he's a great guy. He's a great attorney. So.
Absolutely. No, we're looking forward to talking to him on our last segment here.
Yes.
But Mr. Tateishi, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
This has been informative. Family, pick up this book. Pick up this book and read it. If you're real in this reparation space, get that book. There are so many lessons in it that we can learn from. As I said, there are so many parallels that we can learn from. We're not trying to equate the things. We're not trying to compare. We are trying to learn and get better. And win.
We're going to a commercial break, and we will be right back. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks.
Stick with us.
Bye.
You take folks from their native land, their native country, you bring them into another community where they don't speak the language. You take away the fact that they can reproduce. You take away the fact that they can be educated. You strip them of every piece of dignity of life, and you make them work. And you make them work for free. And so we have not had an equitable playing field for black folks in this country since we were brought here on ships as slaves.
You know, the struggle of African Americans for equality since the beginning of this nation has been one of the greatest inspirations for everyone. And Black people have fought without giving up to make the Constitution and Bill of Rights actually mean something.
We stand, and our progress stands on the shoulders of the gains made by Black Americans in the fight for the civil rights equality in law, but at the lunch counters, at the schools, on the streets, to speak publicly, to get jobs.
We've been fighting for and talking about reparations in the black community actually for hundreds of years. We were promised 40 acres and a mule after slavery. Obviously, those promises were broken by leadership of this country.
As a community who struggled for decades to win redress, it's our moral obligation to support the efforts of others.
It was really important for us to see that African Americans, Black Americans supported our struggles for justice.
It is about how much pain was inflicted upon thousands of American people who happen to be Japanese in terms of ancestry. But this Black American cries out as loudly as my Asian American brothers and sisters.
What's happening, family? We are back from that brief break. What you just saw was a film that was recommended to us by our next guest, Don Tamaki, that's coming out of the Asian community. As you heard John Tatayeshi say, the Asian community is well aware of what's happening in the black community for reparations, and we have some allies, we have some support there. So what you saw was a little piece there that has been put together from their community. But coming up next, we've got our Meet the AB 3121 Task Force segment, or the California Reparations Task Force, Meet the California Reparations Task Force members segment. And we're very honored to have with us today Don Tamaki. And Don Tamaki, he received his BA Phi Beta Kappa from the University of California at Berkeley in 1973, and also received his JD from Berkeley in 1976. He is a managing partner of Minami Tamaki LLP in San Francisco, representing business and nonprofit clients. In 2020, Don was asked to become a member of the California Reparations Task Force in California Reparations Task Force in the state. Well, please welcome to Politics in Black, Mr. Don Tamaki.
Woo-hoo.
Don, good to see you. Can you hear us?
I hear you loud and clear. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Chad, and thank you, Friday.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
No, thank you for being here. We try to speak to all of the task force members just to make sure that our community gets to know you, gets to meet you. You are doing historic and monumentally important work. And we want to make sure that the black community knows the folks that are sitting at the state level and stay engaged with you. And you've been great about that already.
You have. And
Yeah.
I said this to you, and I'll say it on air. I think that your responses, as far as the task force has been concerned, have been very respectful just of the experiences of Black Americans here in this country. And I think that your approach as a commissioner has been very thoughtful. And so we notice and we appreciate you for, I guess, your way of being a commissioner on the task force. But you are such a powerhouse. I almost don't even know where we can begin with you, but I do know one of the things, or some of the themes that have come up from Dean Cherminsky and also with oh my goodness, I have to say Tateishi.
I was
It's the
practicing that in the
Tateishi.
mirror
Yeah,
all night.
we all were. Were this idea of beneficiaries, and this idea of how do you go about figuring out who the beneficiary classes are. We know that one of the law cases that were brought up was the Karamatsu versus the United States. If you could just talk a little bit about that particular case. You guys, your first names rhyme too. John talked about that, and if you could talk about it just a little bit more, because I think that case, in terms of like the whole citizenship and race question, that's not exactly, you know, an African American experience, but I do think that case is one we can learn from.
Well, thank you. Before I, answer the question Friday, I do want to say that, one of the things I learned from the redress and reparations experience for Japanese Americans is how intensely personal
Yes.
it is. It was for Japanese Americans and still is. And so I'm the only non-Black person on the task force itself. And so it struck me in terms of how I need to approach that, certainly with humility and with the understanding that this is intensely personal for task force members, for the Black community. I do feel they carry the burden of generations. And whenever we talk about these subjects at every task force meeting, they're talking about their families, their ancestors, their history. And so it's important to be to honor that and be respectful of it. At the same time, I think it's our job to develop support for non-Black Americans to get behind this. And I see that as part of our role. So, for instance, that trailer, Reparations, was produced by an organization I work for, Stop Repeating History, I work with. And they commissioned the filmmaker John Osaki to do this, targeted really at the Asian American community, about why it's important for Asian Americans and other Americans to get behind, this effort.
Yes.
And so as we proceed with, there's going to be community engagement hearings and other activities that are being scheduled starting in January. That really has to be the thrust. And though there are 40 million Black people in America, more than that actually, we're still dealing with demographics that say that that's 14% of the population. And to get legislation passed, you're talking about moving the needle beyond the 50% mark.
Yes,
Chad,
that math has always been historically unfair, but I digress.
I know it is what it is. Historically unfair, to be sure. I mean, I'm with you. But that's the process we're in whenever we talk about whether it's AB 3121 or HR 40 or the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. That is the math that we had to deal with in terms of our community. So getting back to the Korematsu case, the reason why that is at all relevant and just not a relic of racist history is because in some ways it's more relevant now than when we reopened that Supreme Court case in the early 1980s, because it's a window basically into how systemic racism works. And I totally agree with John Takeishi. There is no equivalence between what Japanese Americans went through and, of course, 400 years of oppression that Black people went through. But as we go through American history and we see it, unfolding, the cannon swings around and points and has pointed and continues to point at Asian Americans as well as other people of color. And that's where the Korematsu case sort of fits in. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Within literally the next day, the FBI, Secret Service agents sweep through, Seattle, Oakland, San Francisco, Portland, parts of Arizona, and arrest leaders in the community. Within a couple months, the president signs an executive order leading to the roundup of almost 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, in which, forcing them out of their homes at gunpoint into 10 concentration camps constructed in the most desolate areas of America, stretching from California to Arkansas. And of course, Japanese Americans lost their jobs, their businesses, some even their lives, certainly their dignity by that mass removal, merely based upon the fact that they happened to look like the enemy. And the government argued that that was necessary because Japanese Americans were spying for Japan, and the Army claimed that we have proof to show for it. There was Fred Korematsu, who was born in Oakland, California, an American citizen, never been to Japan, hardly spoke Japanese, said it was wrong, and he refused to obey. He was arrested, and his case, over the years, it took 3 years, but it got up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944. And to his surprise, he lost. As Dean Chemerinsky said, the court basically said, if the Army tells us that Japanese Americans are a threat, then we believe the Army.
Yeah.
End of story. Ask no questions. And for the next 37 years, the principle stood, and one dissenting opinion in the court case said it lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority who can put forth a plausible claim of an urgent need, meaning without trial, without charges, an entire racial population, men and women, young and old, healthy and infirm, could be put into concentration camps. And quite by accident, 37 years later, now we fast forward to the 1980s, researchers in the archives just happened to stumble upon FBI, Federal Communications Commission, Office of Naval Intelligence reports, basically saying, we know the Army is not telling the truth. Its claims are intentional falsehoods. And there are memos just flying back and forth between Department of Justice lawyers saying, we're about to tell lies before the US Supreme Court in order to defend this program, which should have never happened. We ought not to be doing this. We have a duty to tell the truth.
Yes.
And ultimately, they lost. Their memos went to the Attorney General, to the Solicitor General of the United States, who argues all Supreme Court cases in behalf of the US, fell on deaf ears. And basically, the evidence was not only suppressed, some of it was falsified, and some of it was burned. And so on that basis, we were able to remove Fred Korematsu's criminal conviction and basically say that that whole precedent allowing this terrible thing to happen rests on a foundation of fraud and fabrication.
Yes.
And so, but this is nothing new for Black Americans. I mean, I think, Chad, you mentioned it, and we had talked about this earlier, that Black Americans in particular have not found a friend in the law. And in fact, the law at the time, slavery was legal, Jim Crow was legal, and Black people found themselves more often victims of the law rather than its beneficiaries.
Yes.
But as Dean Chemerinsky said, this is the system we live under. And at the same time those terrible things happen, there are ways for the system to repair itself. And certainly, he cited Thurgood Marshall and the Civil Rights Movement and Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and the Korematsu case. But this sort of gives you a window of systemic racism ebbs and flows in American history. And when it is flowing and it is upholding a cultural norm of white supremacy, you get to points in history, Japanese American incarceration being one of them, where prejudice and racism shouts down the Constitution, shouts down the law, shouts down facts.
Yeah, critical race theory is having that experience right now. And I've heard from what Chemerinsky shared, what Don goodness gracious, John Tateishi shared with regard to the generations and the kids going to college, and they kind of are learning their own history and their parents' history in real time while they're attending college. And then we're kind of in this critical race theory space. I heard the Pequot indigenous people talking about like the Ohio massacre that happened and almost wiped out and decimated, you know, those indigenous people as a people. You know, we have the Black American experience, and sometimes in this country there is often a lot of black and white, but when it comes to critical race theory here, like we really are dealing with America's history in its entirety, and it is constantly fighting against white supremacy. I don't know, doing what white supremacy does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I completely agree with you. In some ways, the jargon, the terminology is a bit unfortunate because it's really history.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it, Friday, and that is, but it's a thing that's been repeated over and over again. It's a willful amnesia. It's intentional erasure. It's people, as far as reparations is concerned, a lot of people for a very long time do not want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've seen that over and over again, whether it's, you know, post-Civil War, the lost cause mythology,
Yes.
or,
Yes.
you know, modern day people discovering what happened in Tulsa now, today,
Mm-hmm.
or even the more recent things about redlining and, you know, the destruction of Black communities and other other communities of color, like Japanese American communities, by redevelopment, by freeways. I mean, over and over again, there's this manipulation of of facts and how things are viewed, and so this effort to correct those things and introduce the histories being labeled critical race theory and become a sort of a bugaboo for very conservative politicians on this.
Yeah.
But that is just, it's not anything new. And part of the task force's charge is to issue a report to educate at least the California public in one place, in one book, although Professors Jardy and Kirsten Mullen and many, many others have written about this.
Yes.
The fact that the California is going to compile and synthesize this all in one place with the stamp or the imprimatur, you know, the legitimacy of the state of California behind it, I think is significant as far as
Absolutely.
educating people what happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. The education component is a recurring theme in these conversations today, because we understand the importance of educating our community. I think it was John in his book that said, you know, in a grassroots campaign, you're only as effective as the education of your constituents. So, you know, we're squarely aligned with that. One of the things I wanted to ask you, pivoting to kind of to work on a task force, we heard from John about the importance of uplifting the Nisei voice, right? In through listening sessions, through encouraging them for written testimony, et cetera. You are now sitting on this task force, and you guys, you know, put in full days when you meet, you know,
Yeah.
sometimes 2 days.
2 days in a row.
And you're hearing testimony at the beginnings of those meetings, a lot of personal testimony. And so I'd like to understand a little bit better through your ears, Don, when those personal testimonies come in, how do you hear them? And how does that influence the thinking of the task force?
Well, we're hearing testimony and we're reading, you know, I'm reading my eyeballs out. I thought I knew something about American history, but really, no. I mean, what is out there in the public, and the enormous amount of information that is not known is appalling and breathtaking. And as we listen to the testimony and as I read it, I alternate between screaming and crying.
Yes.
And makes me want to holler, you know, to quote Marvin Gaye.
Yep.
And so if I'm learning about the extent of the harm, and we're talking not just slavery, but as you know, well know, decades and decades of one accumulation of injustice upon the other, all of which have continuing and cascading consequences into the next decade and the next decade. And I think one of the charges for the task force is to draw a line, a straight line, between the institution of slavery and its badges of slavery, which were Jim Crow, de jure and de facto segregation, its various permutations into redlining, into urban renewal, into criminal justice, prison to pipeline, disparate healthcare, all of that, and the consequences that it has today. That is the task of informing the American public about that. I think, John Tatisha said most people know about slavery, and I think, in general, I guess he's right on that. But I think most people also believe, and I'm not talking about the Black community, but certainly all other communities, is once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the playing field got more and more level.
Yeah.
And
it
it's quite
hasn't.
unbelievable but that's where we're at. And in fact, it's getting worse. The amount of Black home ownership, I'm sure you know this, that is the same as it was in 1968. The wealth gap is widening.
Yes.
And there are reasons for that. I mean, that become more understandable when one knows about the history of what happened. So,
and we don't have to look that far. The rural South, I mean, if anyone has actually taken a trip into almost like any town USA with a main street that has a predominant Black population or a Black population 40% or more, you will see the vestiges literally just driving down the street. You do not have to look long and hard.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm with you.
Yeah. And I just want to underscore that point, Don, because part of what we are engaged in here as NAASDLA and as CJEC is reaching out into the community and making sure that our stakeholders in our community make their voices heard to the task force when you meet and, in between meetings via email, et cetera. So I just wanted to make sure that they understand the importance of those testimonies.
And can I not add what's being planned here? Maybe your audience already knows this, but task force member Cheryl Grills, Professor Grills, has been leading the effort in the community engagement process that's about to start in January.
Yes.
And there are 10 to 12 listening sessions that will be held throughout California. And they'll take testimony, I'm sure, from experts, but I think the key is to also take testimony from ordinary folks and to hear their stories. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because in terms of the Japanese American, redress movement, it really didn't get traction until the personal narratives came out.
Yes.
And you were talking about earlier, Chad, about people not wanting to talk about it.
Yes.
And I suspect, well, this is certainly true in the Japanese American community, things that happened that people blame themselves about and became their own misdirected shame. And they didn't talk about it. And then when they did begin to talk about it, I mean, it was dramatic theater.
Yes.
It was real.
Yes.
I don't mean it in a way that it was made up, but I do mean it in the sense that it was riveting testimony. So I'm hoping that that is a trigger to start conversations for the media to pick it up in a much wider area. I think up until now, as far as news media is concerned, there hasn't been decisions or actions on the part of the task force that have been newsworthy in the sense of coverage, although a lot of work is being done. But I think when the listening sessions start and you get real people talking about their life experience, and whether it's in the health system or employment or the denial of loans, denial of access to capital,
To me,
They're,
even one of the
yeah.
things that always sticks to me is like military advancement, and that's because grandfather, father, or I should say grandfathers with an S, father, great grandfather. I mean, literally back to the Revolutionary War. In my family, like there's that level of service, and I always feel like my family should be like, what is his name?
Colin Powell?
McCain.
Oh, McCain.
Yeah, because like McCain was like all highly decorated
Yeah.
and this and that, and I'm just
You should have
like,
some generals in the family. Yeah.
black folks just
Yeah.
couldn't reach that level of stature within the military,
Yeah.
and anyway,
And
that's just me.
it's even more fundamental with that. I mean, the GI Bills
Yeah,
and the
absolutely.
federally insured loans made available to returning veterans
Absolutely.
were there were federally, it was federal money, but it was administered at the local level.
Yes.
And to the extent the localities, the state and counties, as a normal process, discriminated against Black Americans, those folks, I mean, 98% of those loans, these federally insured loans, went to white people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my father served in the military. He was drafted out of an internment camp, out of a
Wow.
concentration camp. But at least living in the Bay Area as a returning GI, he was able to get a federally insured loan. So he bought a house in Oakland. The white neighbors, shortly thereafter, he tells me, came knocking on the door, demanded that they leave. The real estate agent that sold them the property got fired,
Wow.
but at least he was able to get a loan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't say the same thing for a majority of Black vets.
Absolutely.
And so it's even more fundamental than the promotional aspect in the American military.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. So you actually broached the topic. I kind of want to. I asked all the commissioners here, local and federal, and so you are engaged in this process at the state level. But obviously, we all understand that reparations for the Black community, the Black American community, really is a federal debt. It is something that only the federal government has a financial wherewithal to meet. They are the culpable party. So I'm always interested to hear from state commissioners on this task force how you view your role in the larger and the broader context of federal reparations, and how you feel like your work can either influence or not influence what's happening with like an HR 40 in Congress.
Well, I'm old enough and lucky enough to have lived during the time of the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King was alive. And, we watched the civil rights marches on television news every day. And at that time, the passage of federal legislation was impossible, basically. And so the strategy became more localized. And when those scenes of dogs and fire hoses and Ku Klux Klan and brutality was shown to the nation and to the world, it began a movement that began locally and then regionally, whether it was Montgomery bus boycott or other things. And there have been similar efforts in legislation that are modeled that way, where I'm glad that HR 40 has not 195 co-sponsors in the House, but it still hasn't made it to the floor, and in the Senate, it probably, realistically, not a prayer. Yeah. And so the strategy has turned to more regional and more local to again create a groundswell and have it move upward from there. And I think I'm very glad and proud of the fact that California is the only state so far to take this step. But the whole goal, I think, on this thing, Chad, is to have it replicated.
Yes.
Yeah. So whatever happens in California is replicated in other regions, cities, states, and it moves that way. I think the product will be a report and there'll be testimony, but the real goal is to be part of a movement.
Yes.
All right.
And so I think that's the goal now, and certainly after the task force ends its existence, is to continue to push. And many things that start in California actually end up as legislation federally.
Yes.
So that's another.
That is certainly the hope and the goal here.
All right.
Don, thank you so much for being here today.
Yes.
And thank you for the work that you're doing on this task force. We are appreciative of, our allies and other communities that understand and that come with a unique perspective of justice, and your experience and what you have been engaged in obviously bring a unique perspective to that task force.
Yes.
that I believe rounds out their view. So thank you for everything that you're doing currently.
And thank you so much for doing this. I mean, I think it's our obligation really to support and get behind this effort for a lot of reasons.
Absolutely.
And again, it's the nature of racism that's become so systemic and so normalized that it impacts everybody, not just Black Americans. And so everybody's got skin in this game.
Absolutely.
So I think it's important to widen the circle as much as possible. So I appreciate your efforts in getting the word out.
Yeah, absolutely, Don.
Thank you so much.
We want to
Don.
leverage you. We want to leverage John, and we want to make more outreach into your community, the Japanese American community, the Chinese American community. We want to make sure that we are bringing allies to the table where we can.
Well,
right?
I do want to say there are Asian American groups that are eager to get behind this movement. I think there's a practical question of how you do it, and they're looking for opportunities to partner up. So again, I see that as part of my role. And by Asian American, certainly Japanese American, Asian American, East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian groups. I talked to many of them, and they're very supportive of this effort.
Okay, well, you
you.
got
We're
our
gonna
number.
make that
Stay connected. Let's stay connected, Don. But thank you again, sir, for being here. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
And happy holidays.
You too.
All right. That has been another Politics in Black.
Man, I love that
We
one.
are ending with a bang.
I love that one.
Happy Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, because we will not see you again until January 2022.
Yeah, it's been a long year. It went by fast though. It went by fast. Before we go, I like to give shout outs. So today in history, November 28th, 1898 was the first national convention of the Ex-Slave and Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, chaired by none other than Callie House. So shout out Callie House. And then before we get out of here, I got to give a big congratulations to Hosel and Chaz on their engagement. Congratulations, brother. Black love, I love to see it. Black families, we need more of them.
And thank you, Miss Felicia.
Thank you, Miss Felicia, the whole production team, everybody out there, the Reparations family, the Friedman family. We coming back next year. It's midterms, and we're going to hit the ground running.
Hey.
Yeah. So
see you guys.
Until then, peace, family. Our issues, our voices, our views. This is Politics in Black. Our issues, our voices, our views. This is Politics